Please welcome Professor Michael Chesson to tell the experiences of Dr. Franklin Dyer, a Civil War surgeon. Mr. Chesson is a founding professor and dean of the newly established American College of History and Legal Studies, located here in Salem. Dr. Chesson has a degree in history from the William and Mary College and a PhD in American history from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Chesson has received many honors and has a long academic career. Besides writing books and memberships in 15 historical societies, I don't know how he does it all. Please welcome Dr. Chesson, and remember after the meeting to sign up for the tour next month. We already plugged that, so we don't have to do it again. So with that, I give you our speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. And actually, my doctorate is from that little school in Cambridge. I did a year at Johns Hopkins, but I had to leave. And I appreciate Jonathan Worth inviting me, and I can't think of a more appropriate day than Flag Day to talk about Dr. J. Franklin Dyer. The flag and that document that Jonathan was paraphrasing from are what Frank Dyer was fighting for. In New England, history takes you by surprise. And perhaps that's happened to some of you doing a research project, your family genealogy, some local history, what have you. Years ago, a student at UMass Boston, where I taught for 32 years, approached me after class one day and he said, "Would you like to look at some Civil War papers of one of my ancestors?" And I said, of course, little knowing the treasure that was coming, because I assumed that he would bring me a copy of the New York Times from 1861, or perhaps some Confederate currency, or what I was really hoping to see was his ancestors' compiled service record. And in a few days, the student brought me a thick volume bound in green leather, and it was the surgeon, the surgeon's journal, Dr. J. Franklin Dyer of the 19th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, written entirely in ink, in his own hand, beautiful script, and it contained the excerpts from wartime letters that he had written to his wife in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I was impressed by the entries, knowing a little bit about the Civil War in the East and the Army of the Potomac, and his service in the Army from July of 1861 until August of 1864, when he was mustered out during the siege of Petersburg and returned home. My student said that his aunt had copies of family letters in scrapbooks, along with a variety of items relating to Dr. Dyer, including his surgeon's sword, his green sash, 2 medical kits that he carried on the field of battle, uniform buttons, and some other items. And she controlled the manuscript and would decide who should edit it. Well, some say this conflict is the war that never ended. But I found out very quickly why I did not go into sales. Because when I made a cold call to Mrs. Whitmer, I found her to be a proper New England lady, but just a little bit on the frosty side. She found my academic credentials acceptable. The Harvard degree helped, but she had one big reservation. I'm a white Virginian, a native Southerner. She did not believe that I could edit her ancestors' journal fairly and objectively. And I assured her that I respect physical courage and integrity regardless of the uniform. And we reached an agreement, and she loaned me several scrapbooks filled with family letters, and I started the editorial process. The letters that she loaned me were those that Frank Dyer wrote from just before Gettysburg, starting in June of 1863 through August of 1864 and his discharge from the Army. Jonah Franklin Dyer was born April 15, 1826 in Eastport, Maine. He was the 4th of 7 children of Charles Dyer, who was a Maine native, and Hannah Snow of Nova Scotia. His roots go back to the founding of New England. He had military ancestors on both sides of his family. Captain Jonah Dyer, his grandfather, fought in the Revolution, was captured by the British, and after his release, settled in Maine. A more distant ancestor, the Quaker Mary Dyer, was hanged, as you know, in Boston Common in 1660. His maternal line descended from Nicholas Snow, a passenger on the Mayflower to Plymouth Plantation in 1623. He married Constance Hopkins, the daughter of Stephen Hopkins. He served under Captain Miles Standish. Nicholas and Constance had 12 children. And their descendants served in various wars against the Indians and also the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War. Jonah's father, Charles Dyer, died in 1844, and Jonah was still 14. Charles Henry Dyer, his oldest brother, was starting the career that would eventually make him a prosperous merchant in Eastport. But at the time of their father's death, he was still an apprentice. He assumed the paternal role as the oldest son. He advised Frank, who by 1846 preferred his middle name to Jonah, and he cared for their mother and their youngest siblings, George and Adelaide. William Snow Dyer had moved a few miles away to run a general store. And in one of the surviving letters, he worried that Charles appears to have the charge of all the family, and it is a heavy burden. He also joshed his younger brother Frank about being a pharmacist. He'd recently apprenticed himself to a druggist, and he said, "Rolling out pills, I think you would look queer." Dr. Franklin Dyer, you know, who would believe it? In a letter written before the Battle of the Wilderness, Dr. Dyer regretted that he had not yet been able to buy a pony for their son Frankie. He said, "I mean that he shall have one sometime, for I know how I wanted such things and couldn't have them. And for that reason I want him to." That's a doting father, not a reflection of his own youth. Dozens of the family letters in the scrapbook showed me that Frank's childhood was of a middle status, neither rich nor poor. His mother took occasional trips back to New Brunswick to visit relatives. She hired a servant girl to help around the house when she could find someone suitable, and the boys got a good education. George was learning Latin in the 1840s. And when Frank finally decided to go to medical school, William arranged to have his old text sent to him. More important for a man who would see 3 years of war, Frank's family was a warm and loving one. The bond between the brothers was particularly strong. They wrote regularly to each other. They loaned each other money, even when hard-pressed themselves. Frank benefited from his family's generosity, but he was not the only one to do so. William wanted to use young George in his store, but thought better that George stay in school. When his father died, Frank was already the editor of a small Eastport weekly, the Sentinel. In less than 2 years, he was forced to abandon journalism for health reasons, unspecified. Frank wrote him, did you give this, or rather, William wrote him in 1846, he said, "Did you give up the newspaper business because of smoking? Is that why you quit the cigars?" Frank didn't respond, at least not directly. Charles warned Frank about moving to New York City and going into what he called the rather uncertain business of daguerreotyping. And Frank also thought of going to Wisconsin with brother William, who was going out west. And William did go to Milwaukee in 1847. He wrote back boasting of the opportunities in Milwaukee compared with those in New England. And when he returned to New England, he found that he couldn't borrow the money that he needed to set up business for himself and compete with established firms in Milwaukee, and he soon went west with other 49ers. Frank, meanwhile, had decided to become an apothecary. He apprenticed himself for 3 years to a druggist in South Berwick, Maine. His mother and the family physician thought it was the best of several options for his health. He began working for Dr. Charles T. Trafton, and he studied medicine with him from August 1846 until February 1848 while working in the pharmacy. A friend wrote him, "Since you concluded to go into the apothecary business, that 3 years was too long to devote to the study of pharmacy." This pal and a Dr. Parsons that they both knew told him that only a few months' reading of medical books and a few months more of rudimentary practice, sort of on-the-job training, presumably some of the patients would recover and some might not, but that was all you needed to set yourself up as a pharmacist. Fortunately for his Army comrades and other patients, Frank was intent on more advanced studies. He visited in 1847 with his employer, Augustus Trafton, the son of his boss, who was graduating from the Medical School of Maine in Brunswick, co-located with Bowdoin College and staffed by Bowdoin faculty. Lacking money to pay for medical lectures, Frank decided he wanted to go to the Medical School of Maine too. His family sought loans. His mother started calling in IOUs and asking for favors and trying to amass the funds to pay for her son's medical school. He began at Brunswick in February of 1848, the same month that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain enrolled as a Bowdoin freshman. A friend wrote to congratulate him, "You are now then fairly committed as a disciple of Aesculapius and have taken a seat in the consecrated halls of Bowdoin. Well, go it, and see that you go it thoroughly. Be not a superficial pretender. Pause not till thoroughly informed in every branch of your anticipated profession." That's how they wrote back then. And of course, they wrote a lot. Documentation for future historians. Good luck documenting what we're doing today with Twitter and social media and a lot of other conversations that aren't going to survive. Frank's money troubles continued. Before the start of his last term in February 1849, he asked to attend the medical lectures on credit. The professors told him that wasn't possible. Only in extreme cases would that be allowed. One teacher told him to borrow the funds for the necessary lecture tickets. Another suggested he pay half the fee in advance if he couldn't come up with the entire amount. Somehow Frank got the money. He finished his coursework in 1849. He completed a thesis on acute hydrocephalus and was approved for the MD. Young Dr. Dyer moved to Boston. He continued his studies with an older physician that summer while waiting for his degree to be formally conferred. Older brother Charles wrote him, "I feel very much pleased to think that you have succeeded in getting a situation and hope that you may do well." Frank's diploma came in September, but he found it hard to establish himself in the hub with its large medical fraternity. He decided to relocate to Annisquam, a village in Gloucester on the Cape Ann Peninsula, which may have lacked a resident physician. But in any event, he found it easier to establish himself there and build a practice that would support him. And he practiced medicine in Annisquam and in Gloucester Center the remainder of his life. Frank had a healthy interest in young women. Talk of them filled the letters between the brothers and other male friends. Charles told him, "Be a good boy and keep straight." William warned about young women, especially factory girls, meaning the mill workers near the pharmacy in South Berwick. A Boston druggist who was a partner with Dr. Trafton, Frank's boss, wrote that women were a failing of young men. A friend in Eastport told of the sudden death of a wife, commenting, "Strange, isn't it, how many young married women die?" And Brother Charles wrote that William had had to testify in the trial of a man accused of murdering his wife. William had sold him the poison. Then he told of two young men they both knew. One asked the other, "How did you meet your wife?" And his friend responded, "I got acquainted with her promiscuously." And that's how he spelled it, P-E-R. After Charles married in September 1847, he found that it agreed with him, and he played matchmaker for Frank the next year. He told Frank, "The correspondence you're carrying on with a particular local woman, I think you and she are doing a great business, but watch out that you do not get smashed with her pretty face." Friends wrote of women who wanted to meet him, and Frank replied, "God keep me from all such things." Less than 2 years after moving to Annisquam, Frank had a practice that would support a wife. On May 4th, 1853, he married Maria Haskell French, but whether it was in Boston or back in Eastport, as suggested on Ancestry.com, is uncertain. Like Frank, she was 27 and had only a month to live. She died in Annisquam on June 6. Frank Dyer had good relations with her parents, even after he remarried, following the customary period of mourning. His second wife was Maria Davis of Hancock, New Hampshire, 2 years younger than Frank when they married September 7, 1854. Most of his wartime letters were addressed to this second Maria, whose name the family pronounced with a long I. Frank Dyer served from July 1861 until August 28, 1864. He mustered into federal service on August 3rd. At 35, he was one of the oldest officers in the 19th Massachusetts. He rose to become the 3rd Brigade's surgeon, the surgeon-in-chief of the 2nd Division, and the acting medical director of the entire 2nd Corps, Army of the Potomac. He served on the staff of Generals Oliver O. Howard, John Gibbon, and Winfield Scott Hancock. Dyer developed a healthy respect for Confederate infantry and a corresponding scorn for Union cavalry. He felt about the cavalry sort of like infantry today feel about aviators. Dyer thought Lee a dangerous opponent, and he considered Stonewall Jackson a God-fearing man, and his death a severe loss to the South. Here's how this Yankee described the secession crisis not long after he came home from the war. Obedient to the will of their political leaders, the South raised the standard of rebellion. The people of the North rose to overcome it. Whatever errors may have been committed in the beginning, in failing to appreciate the magnitude of the undertaking, they were alike shared by all, both North and South. I consider this a just and righteous war on our part, and I should not be doing my duty if I did not take part in it. In July 1861, before Bull Run, he offered his services to Dr. William J. Dale, Surgeon General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And after a medical exam, they gave him a test, they gave him some questions, they asked him about various operations. He was accepted and appointed the acting surgeon of the 19th Massachusetts Regiment. Well, Frank survived Ball's Bluff that fall. He steamed down to Chesapeake Bay the following spring for McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. He described the Virginians, white and black, the physical surroundings, and various battles as McClellan's army moved slowly up the peninsula toward Richmond. He withstood Army brass and his medical superiors, insisting that McClellan's troops were suffering from scurvy. Their teeth were falling out, lack of fresh vegetables, and they were showing other classic symptoms of scurvy. And everyone was saying, you're wrong, keep quiet, and he would not keep quiet. And finally, medical inspectors were sent down from Washington to shut him up, and they concluded, the men are suffering from scurvy. This diagnosis was a brave act, and it was praised by the compilers of the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion when they put that collection of volumes together in the 1880s. It's on the reading list that I distributed. The MSH has details about many of his most difficult operations. Like most Army surgeons of this war, Frank did not include the gore in his letters home to his dear wife. You'd have to read the medical and surgical history, the 26 case reports that are cited by the compilers of this mammoth reference, to learn that Dyer had medical ability and knowledge well above the average. His case reports are cited on wounds and injuries of the spine, abdomen, and hip joint, lower and upper extremities, rectum, and testis. He described amputations of the shoulder, arm, elbow, and thigh, and he wrote long reports on scurvy, typhoid, continued fevers, and chronic rheumatism. Leaving the peninsula, he was at Second Bull Run in August 1862, and as John Pope retreated, Dyer experienced friendly fire. I've never known why they call it that, because it can kill you just as dead. A gun went off accidentally on the night march. The cavalry panicked, thinking they were being attacked, and they started galloping about chaotically, and the infantry started firing in every direction, and Dr. Dyer, mounted on horseback, and his assistant surgeon, also on a horse. The assistant surgeon was hit in the leg, and Dr. Dyer could not find an ambulance for him, so he sent the regimental chaplain, the Reverend Ezra Winslow, while he tended his badly wounded colleague. And of Reverend Winslow, he remarked in his journal, did not see the chaplain again for 3 months. He did not stop until he got to Massachusetts. Frank Dyer's scorn could be withering for those who showed what he called the white feather. When the wounded Dr. Hill got to the lines around Washington, he was denied admission because of red tape, and he died 3 days later of his wound, a victim of paperwork. And Dyer mourned him, and he would miss him in the months ahead, because this doctor from Charlestown, Massachusetts, was the only competent assistant he'd ever have. His most stirring language was about battles. Took position near Antietam Creek Monday night and remained there all of Tuesday, the 13th and 14th of September, 1862. The rebels threw shot and shell at us from their position on the other side of the creek, went up on the hill in our front and had a good view of their lines, though in not a safe position by any means. Next morning, ordered to be ready at daylight, without knapsacks and with 80 rounds cartridges. Our corps marched in 3 columns, our regiment leading 1 column. Dr. Willard and myself, with our attendants, went into the fight with our regiment, as did most of the surgeons in our corps. We forded the Antietam, advanced nearly a mile in the same direction through plowed ground, cornfields, and woods, then faced to the front, forming line of battle, and advanced over the same kind of ground nearly a mile toward the rebel lines. All this distance, we were under the fire of rebel batteries. A shell would plow through the ranks, a break would be seen, and as the line passed on, 1 or more men would be seen lying on the ground. The battle was actually fought on Friday, September 17th. Getting nearer, we passed many wounded who had been lying there since the night before, both rebels and our own. While occupied in dressing wounds in the rear of the regiment, just in the edge of the woods, the fire became pretty hot. Kirby's battery was ahead of us, a little to the left, about 70 yards distant. The rebels came up in heavy masses to take it, pouring in an irregular but terrific fire. The battery was well worked and threw showers of canister among them. A regiment in support got up and fled past us through the woods. The battery maintained its position, however, and drove off the assailants, after which, anticipating a more vigorous attack, it moved to the rear. When the fire slackened, we were obliged to move, our lines having fallen back, our regiment to the right and rear, and our whole corps having been considerably shattered. At night, the enemy held possession of a small part of the field, but we held most of it. Next day, but little was done except to remove the wounded, and the night following the rebels left. I went over the battlefield on Friday, and even then all the wounded had not been removed, many of them having been within the rebel lines. The fight had raged over a space about 3 miles in length by 2 in width, and in places where the rebel line was formed, a perfect row of dead was lying. In one place behind a rail fence, the rebel dead were lying as closely as if their line had laid down for shelter. I met the medical director of the Corps, who ordered me to go to the Hoffman House and take charge. The wounded were fast coming in, and in an hour there were 500 there. Remained 24 hours. I got relieved to go and collect together some of the wounded of my own regiment who were in other places. They're scattered improvised hospitals all over the area. Colonel Hinks, with 3 other officers, was at Mr. Pry's Valley Mills. Found him severely wounded, a ball having passed through the right forearm, shattering the radius. The radius is the arm to the front of your forearm. It's the thicker or shorter of the bones in your arm. Passing through the abdomen, it came out on the left of his spine. Surgeons who had examined his wound considered his case quite hopeless, and very little had been attempted for his relief. I cannot say how many thousand wounded are in this vicinity, but every house and barn for miles is filled with them. All the churches and schoolhouses in Sharpsburg are used as hospitals, also those in Gettysburg and Boonesboro. It was the bloodiest day in American history. The wounded are being removed from hospitals near the field as the odor is horrible. Hundreds of horses were killed. They were generally burnt. Citizens have been flocking in by hundreds, not to render assistance, but to go over the battlefield and pick up mementos, such as broken muskets, etc., and some to steal what they can find. But there is nothing about the poor, ragged rebels to covet. Many good-hearted men have come from neighboring towns, brought supplies, and taken with the hospitals at Frederick City and Hagerstown. Surgeons have come from Baltimore and other places, but I am sorry they do not care to stop and do the work. Frank often complained that civilian surgeons would not do routine operations. Returning to Virginia, he watched the crossing of the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg by Burnside's army in December 1862, amphibious crossing led by the 19th Massachusetts. His hospital was at the Lacey House, vividly described by Walt Whitman, civilian nurse, on the north side of the river. When Whitman first approached the Lacey House, he knew it was a hospital because outside the windows there were enormous piles of arms and legs. After the defeat at Fredericksburg and Burnside's removal as the commanding general, Dyer had breakfast with Joe Hooker the morning of Chancellorsville. And the journal is filled with these kinds of details. The first of the surviving letters to his wife was written in June 1863 at the start of the Gettysburg campaign, and then this one on Thursday. Near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 2nd, midnight. You have heard of the battle ere this reaches you. It is over now, and thousands lay dead and wounded in the hospitals, under the trees, and about the barns. The fight was terrible. We marched from our camp of last night about 4 miles to the front and took position this morning for the second day of Gettysburg. Skirmishing and artillery firing occupied nearly all day until we found their position, and the fight began at about 4 o'clock in earnest. From that time till after 8, the roar of battle was terrific. They came down on our left with a large force and at first overpowered us. We threw in more troops and they brought more. Column after column formed into the gap, which they tried to force but were baffled. The gap, of course, had been created by that idiot, Dan Sickles. About dark, Sedgwick came up and they were forced back. Several times my heart almost failed me as our men were forced back. But when I saw Uncle John Sedgwick's flag advancing, I knew we should check them, or the Sixth Corps would not survive. John Sedgwick, Union general, his men called him Uncle John because they loved him. He wasn't a very good general, but did have the loyalty and love of his troops. And Union Corps had Corps insignia. And the insignia of the 6th Corps, Army of the Potomac, was a Greek cross. And when Dyer, in desperation, is looking around for reinforcements to save his hospital and his patients and his part of the Army, what he sees coming across the field toward him is a large flag with a cross on it. And he knew he was going to be saved because the 6th Corps had a good reputation. We were nearly driven out of our hospital, but held on, and afterward were relieved by their being driven back. I was so busy I could not indulge curiosity to watch more than I saw before me, but I never saw or heard such fighting. Hour after hour, the volleys poured incessantly. I have about 500 or 600 in hospital. I have no knowledge of the number killed and wounded. It is to be reckoned by the thousands. In fact, it added up to tens of thousands. I have sat down in the kitchen of the little house where we are to write. The family have fled, and well they might. All took their children and fled, leaving their homes, perhaps not to find them again, as the rebels burnt several houses. The fight will probably be renewed in the morning. I hope we shall be able to hold our position, if nothing more. But it is 1 o'clock. I must get a little sleep and be up at daylight. Good night. God help us and give us the victory. Our Army has fought with desperation and will fight tomorrow. We have done the best we could. And if we fail, it is because we have not men enough, or God is not on our side. Next letter, Field Hospital near Gettysburg, July 4th. Dear M, about 1 o'clock, the enemy fired his artillery, 100 pieces, as we heard afterward, and ours replied. Along the whole line, there was a perfect roar. We had probably more guns than they, and the fire was so incessant that it blended together in one roar. For at least 4 hours, it continued without cessation. Batteries fired till all the men were disabled, and infantry detailed to take their places. Guns and caissons were knocked to pieces, wheels replaced, and knocked to pieces again. Guns fired till they were heated and taken off to cool, and new batteries put in their place. Horses killed by the hundred. It seemed as impossible for one to escape as it would to escape a drop of rain in a shower. Generals Hancock and Gibbon wounded, some generals killed. Zook of 3rd Division, Colonel Cross, who had just been promoted, 5th New Hampshire, and some officers and men by thousands. Then line after line of the enemy infantry came up in front of our division. They broke through at one point where the 2nd Brigade were posted. Our old 3rd Brigade wheeled around and poured such a fire into them that today I saw the ground fairly covered with their dead. Here 21 rebel colors were taken. Our regiment took 4. I saw lots of them. They were finally repulsed from every point, and hundreds of prisoners, some say thousands, remained in our hands with all their wounded. We are victorious. For 3 days they have attempted to force our lines and were 3 times repulsed. The last assault, Pickett's charge, was a desperate one. Never in the history of the war was known such a fiercely contested fight and such slaughter. The 2nd Corps has lost probably 3,000 in killed and wounded. The 19th Massachusetts, at least 60. The 19th Maine, his brother George's regiment, 212. They did bravely. Colonel Revere of the 20th Massachusetts is dead. We have lost heavily. The rebel army is in danger of destruction. Leaving behind surgeons to care for the wounded, Frank Dyer rode south with Meade's army in its pursuit of Lee. He rejoiced in the victory over A.P. Hill at Bristow Station, and he suffered the cold at Mine Run, and then got a furlough home to see his wife and son and family in Hancock, New Hampshire. He returned to camp just as Grant began the overland campaign, as soon as the snow melted in the spring of '64. Frank rarely boasted. He has all the usual Yankee virtues, and as far as I can tell, none of the vices. With Frank Dyer, what you see is what you get. So he rarely boasted, but during the overland campaign, he said, Hancock and I run this machine, by which he meant the Second Corps. He is now the medical director of that legendary organization. At Spotsylvania's Bloody Angle, he saw hundreds of rebel prisoners taken, including 2 generals. And Winfield Scott Hancock was cursing at the top of his lungs as only Hancock could curse, and demanding a pencil so he could write his after-action report. And Dyer handed him a stub. And Mariah wrote him, "Did you get the pencil back?" as a souvenir. And Frank growls in his response, "Nobody ever gets anything back that they loan to Hancock." Of the man now directing the war, Dyer wrote, "There is nothing very remarkable in General Grant's appearance. He is a common-sized man, looks tough and healthy, but you would not pick him out of a crowd of officers as a remarkable man. But then our magnificent men are not always the best soldiers. Grant rides a fine bay horse with a handsome embroidered saddlecloth and was well dressed. The gossip about his extreme simplicity is nonsense. He dresses as becomes his position, no more, no less." After Cold Harbor, Grant stole a march on Lee. Dyer rejoiced that Marsh Robert had been outflanked as the Army of the Potomac crossed the James River on the longest pontoon bridge ever erected in wartime. They put it up and took it down after the Army had crossed in 4 days. But Grant's subordinates, including Ben Butler, whom Dyer detested, failed him. Petersburg was saved. Grant settled in for a siege. Dyer saw the crater explosion and witnessed a number of other fights. The doctor's opinion of black soldiers evolved. Responding to Mariah's home front news about draft resistance in the North, he wrote her a few weeks after Gettysburg, "Those who cried out with horror when Negro soldiers were talked of now cry out, 'Why don't you send the Negroes to fight?' Very well. I would rather have a good, hardy Negro than 20 copperheads who lack courage to fight for their country or openly against it. I have some respect for a good soldier if he is a rebel, who is willing to fight for what he calls his rights, but none for a sneaking traitor who dares do neither one thing nor the other." At Petersburg, he reported, "I find the colored troops are getting into favor among all. They appear to be very soldierly looking and feel that they are quite elevated by being made soldiers. I saw some fine-looking colored soldiers bring in a miserable wretch of a rebel on a stretcher, and I thought at the time they were the better men. They could easily have saved themselves by putting a bayonet through him, but they brought a good many in." Frank's opinion of women in Army hospitals never changed, the clearest sign of his innate conservatism and his adherence to military tradition, as seen in this Gettysburg comment. "Most of the women quarreled with each other, each whispering very quietly that they didn't want to associate with some others on account of their reputation being not good. It is singular that each one was the only truly pious and virtuous one in the whole lot. A man wounded in the head wanted one to wash and fix him up a little as the blood had dried on his face. Of course, the surgeons cannot go about washing men's faces, and if these women can do anything, that is what they can do. 'My dear friend,' said she, 'I will read you a chapter from the Bible, and that will do just as well.' Rather doubtful. These outsiders may have good intentions, but they don't know how to do anything. I have heard that one has been threatening to come here, but I will not have her about. Very severe on the ladies, I suppose, but I've had enough of them about field hospitals. I see that Miss Clara Barton, who was at the Lacey House last December, is down at Morris Island, South Carolina. I hope she will stay there or not come here. She plagued me so that I had to get her out of the cookhouse and put one of my own men in charge." He grudgingly acknowledged the contributions of other civilians. At Petersburg, he wrote, "There is no sanitary or Christian commission that ever did or ever could do what many suppose in our field hospitals. They have large numbers and full supplies at City Point. They do a great deal toward feeding and clothing the wounded, but it is a mistake to suppose that they go to the battlefield, bring off wounded, or do anything but the most insignificant share of work. They do a great deal afterward, though. During his last week in the Army, he was almost captured and escaped death twice. On the Weldon Railroad at Reams's Station, the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the 2nd Corps and Gregg's Cavalry Division, a total of 9,000 men, were tearing up Lee's rail link to Wilmington, North Carolina, the last blockade-running port still open to the Confederacy. And they were overwhelmed by a Confederate attack. August 25th, 1864, the rebels first attacked us on the right, then left, and being repulsed both times, brought a large force and attacked us on all sides with great impetuosity. This last charge was very obstinate, and the enemy's fire from one side of our position reaching across to the other, a part of our line had a fire in both front and rear. Our lines finally gave way. The 19th Massachusetts and most of the 20th were taken. Finding the lines broken and the enemy coming over our works, I got the ambulance train started ahead and soon followed with several other medical officers. There being but one road to pass over, and the rebels having directed their fire toward that quarter, it became quite dangerous to pass that way. But the hope of coming home in 2 or 3 days on the one hand, and the prospect of quarters in Libby Prison on the other, being duly weighed, I concluded to run the gauntlet, the shot and shell from our captured batteries following us pretty fast, and the last one, a round shot, solid iron ball, throwing the dirt in our faces as we rode along congratulating ourselves on being out of range. At dark we were on the road, and before morning back near old camp on the Plank Road. I stopped with General Gibbon along the road, and one contributing a rubber coat and the other a cape. We slept under a tree 2 or 3 hours. Next day picked up our stragglers, established our hospital, and took care of a wounded, and began to reckon up our losses and gains, the latter very small, the former rather large. The next day, Frank tied up loose ends for his successor, got his mustering out papers, and after a ceremony and banquet in his honor, Dyer left 2nd Corps headquarters. Writing on August 27th from City Point, where he was about to get on a steamer and come back to Massachusetts. City Point was a giant supply depot, and it was Grant's headquarters. He wrote, "My troubles were not yet over. Wishing to see my brother George, who was in the 18th Corps, I followed the road up toward the city. But few men had arrived to take the places of those that had left, and the lines in some parts were unoccupied except by pickets. There was silence all along the line. The roads and fields through which we passed were quiet and unoccupied, and the pleasant morning sun shone down on a scene of perfect rest. While urging my horse to jump a gully in the road, zip came a bullet just before my eyes, and in a second another at my orderly. Others followed in quick succession, but generally too high. Finding ourselves unnecessarily exposed, lots of Yankee understatement in this journal, we dismounted and found we were very near the enemy's lines. But some of our men who were near, concealed in gopher holes, who had escaped our observation, replied to the enemy's fire while we walked across the field leading our horses. A sharp fire all along the line with artillery accompaniment was the consequence of our reconnaissance. Sergeant Meehan, his orderly, remarked that we had raised the devil along the whole line. Guess the Johnnies thought it was General Grant. I concluded that as I was out of the service, I would mind my own affairs and go home while I still had a head on my shoulders. The military, the first thing they teach you perhaps is don't volunteer, and the second thing is don't be a tourist. Don't go anywhere you don't have to go. And trying to find his brother, whom he loved, he'd almost gotten himself killed. Frank got a joyous welcome from family and friends in Gloucester, but he returned to Virginia in December to care for his badly wounded brother-in-law, Lieutenant Heber James Davis of the 7th New Hampshire. Recruited in Manchester, served through the end of 1865. Finding his medical practice gone, he sought political appointments to support himself until he could attract new patients. He discovered, like many veterans, that civilian memories fail once a war is over. He was disappointed in his efforts to find a position, despite glowing letters of recommendation from Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, Major General Alexander Webb, and other prominent men. Frank Dyer finally managed to win the lucrative post of Gloucester Postmaster. That appointment required that he support the policies of the new President Andrew Johnson and the Ben Butler wing of the state Republican Party, and that he contribute to both, which Dyer refused to do. He lost the job before he could fill it, even though the news of his appointment had been announced in Gloucester and Boston newspapers. Finally, he found a temporary job as acting surgeon at the local fort on Cape Ann. Dyer resumed his life with Maria and Frankie. The second son, Edward James, was born in 1869, but Frankie died of consumption in July 1875, a month short of his 19th birthday, before he could start his sophomore year in Bowdoin. Frank held positions of increasing responsibility and beat his Democratic opponent for a term in the legislature in 1869. He really enjoyed that, beating that Democrat. His greatest honor was being elected the third mayor of the newly incorporated city of Gloucester in 1878, though his official oil portrait later disappeared. While I was working on the Journal, a volunteer on the city's archives committee made herself notorious with the custodians and the staff in the city hall, and eventually, unlocking many little cubby holes and closets, she found the official portrait of Mayor Dyer under a tarp, hidden in a broom closet. There's a story there, but we'll probably never know what it was. His health, not good as an adolescent, had been ruined by 3 years of service, especially the last winter of 1863-64. After a bout of pneumonia in June 1878, he developed active symptoms of tuberculosis. Frank Dyer died at his Annisquam home on February 9, 1879, 2 months short of his 53rd birthday. When the 19th Massachusetts Regimental History finally appeared in 1906, more than 40 years after he left the service, the survivors of the regiment still remembered their surgeon. His comrades called him one of the most skillful physicians in the Army, a man of gentle temperament, but thorough in every detail of his position. Quarter century after his death, the regiment's rear guard, nearing their own end, called him a great surgeon. Maria raised Ned with the aid of Frank's brothers and her pension as a veteran's widow. When women won the vote, Maria, like Frank, a fervent Republican, was one of the first to register at the Annisquam Village Hall. Active throughout her life in women's clubs, she was the city's expert on rare flowers. Frank's early death and her extended widowhood were part of the cost of the preservation of the Union, a price paid by Maria and countless other women and children. Like Queen Victoria, after Prince Albert's death, she never remarried. Perhaps she felt that no man could take the place of her major. Maria died in June 1925 of a cerebral hemorrhage brought on by bronchitis. The Gloucester Daily Times announced on its front page that the city's oldest resident was gone. Edward Dyer followed his mother in 1928 after years at a state hospital suffering from epileptic psychosis. He was buried in Oak Grove Cemetery with his parents and brother Frank. The inscription on the simple obelisk has only the dates and places of Dr. Dyer's birth and death. There's no mention of his political roles in Gloucester, his generation of service as a physician, or what he did in the war for the Union. Perhaps Frank Dyer would have wanted it that way, a Maine man and a Massachusetts surgeon who had only done what duty required. Thank you. You might have. Yes, sir.
You mentioned several places where the doctor's field hospital was about to be overrun by the opposition. What was the usual outcome of that? I mean, this is well before the Geneva Convention, of course. So.
It certainly was before the Geneva Convention, but by the summer of 1862, both sides had adopted a kind of protocol where they would not hold as POWs the other side's surgeons. So if a hospital was overrun, they might take your prisoners enlisted in officers, your patients enlisted in officers, but they wouldn't take the doctors, they wouldn't take the surgeons. They would simply be left there or returned to their side, sent through the lines to the army whose position had been overrun. Some of the officers, not just medical officers, but line officers in McClellan's army were accused of deliberately allowing themselves to be captured and then quickly exchanged, knowing that they would not have to fight again until their opposite number, a colonel or a major or a lieutenant on the other side, was exchanged. And this would extend a time when you weren't being shot at. Dyer had scorn for them as well. But he operated on Confederate wounded as well as Union. He saved lives on both sides. His medical reports are extensive. The actual manuscripts had long statistical appendices, which the publishers chose not to print because they're so hard to format. But you can watch dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of men marching across page after page. Of course, many of them dying. Chances of being killed by a microbe or an infection, at least 3 times that of being killed by a bullet. The rate of infection is just incredible. Diseases of various kinds. They had no knowledge of sanitation or sterilization or the germ theory. And the surgeon that is performing these operations, he saws off a leg, he wipes it on his bloody apron, and then saws off an arm. And then repeats the process, and it would take about 3 minutes to saw off a leg. But anesthesia was widely available, particularly on the Union side.
Did they have anything to use to kind of fight against the infection or swelling?
Almost nothing. They had what they called wholesome pus. Well, that wasn't the exact term they used, but it was a sign that the infection was cleansing itself when this pus was exuded, and they would use maggots to eat the decaying flesh to try and clean the decaying or dead flesh away.
So was gangrene?
That was a constant danger. Trying to amputate that limb before it set in and amputate high enough so you're cutting off good flesh and not flesh that is already infected with gangrene. They didn't give you liquor as an anesthetic because it's a depressant, not a stimulant. And the last thing you want to give a man in that shape is a depressant. And they wouldn't give them bullets to bite on. It was too much danger they'd swallow them. They might give you a leather strap or a piece of rope, something that could be pulled out if the man in his paroxysms or in his spasms started trying to swallow it. If you go to the medical and surgical history, which is about 7,500 pages, they have lithographs, they have detailed drawings of wounds to every part of a man's body, showing the most horrible injuries that you can imagine. And Dyer is writing detailed case reports like many other surgeons. North and South, for a generation after the war, the most skilled surgeons that you would find in Boston or Chicago or Atlanta were Army surgeons who had served on one side or the other. The founders of the American Medical Association, many of them were Civil War surgeons. You know, within a few years after the war's end, we've got Lister, we've got sterilization, we began to have some new drugs, some new discoveries, some new inventions. If some of those things had come just a few years sooner, casualty rate would have been much lower.
Do they have those manuscripts of his clothing and stuff on display any place, like in a museum or historical society?
Mrs. Whitmer and the family asked me to check out various archives in the area that they might donate them to, because her mother had passed and she didn't want responsibility for them, and she wanted them to go to a reputable archive. And I investigated a number of places, and the one that I thought was probably the best and the most appropriate was the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. So she and her husband took all the manuscripts, the uniform, the sword, the medical kits. There are pictures in the book of all of those things. She took them to Salem and they donated them. And it wasn't too long thereafter that I guess they got a new director or a new board, and they decided to downsize the archives and de-emphasize research and build this big new museum and bring in tourists and lots of tourist dollars. So the last time I was there, you could visit the archives maybe 2.5 days a week, very, very abbreviated research hours. If you're trying to write the next big book on the Civil War, you better be prepared to spend a long time in Salem because you're only going to be able to get in there about 2.5 days a week. Most of the archivists and librarians were fired. Institutional decision. You just don't know when those things are going to happen. So I think all of those manuscripts and the uniforms and the sword are, I'm sure they're locked up safe somewhere, but I don't know how you would get to see them. Probably have to make an appointment. Yes.
What was the anesthesia?
They used laudanum, they used ether, they used, they had a variety of...
They had morphine, didn't
They had morphine, sure, for pain.
they? Lots of it, yeah.
Yeah. That produced addictions in some men. Some men brought on social diseases to their wives and girlfriends. I mean, the rate of sexual infidelity was just extraordinary. I mean, nothing compared to the current Congress, but it was way up there.
He's got US
Yes, sir.
Just to give you a little input, I belong to a Civil War group, and some of our people portray surgeons. And I believe one of the knives that's in their surgeon's kit is about this long.
Yeah.
Even though they have an assistant with them, the tendency is for them to have two free hands to work, so they put the knife right there.
Oh,
Sure.
So now you know how they transmitted a lot of things to their patients, and they never knew it.
yeah, to themselves, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a collection of letters from a Union color sergeant from New York. He came up to Boston on a visit. It's called Irish Green and Union Blue, published by Fordham University Press. And while he was in Boston, he had a wee nip or two and spent all of his money and didn't have fare to get back to New York City to rejoin his wife. So he enlisted in the Union Army in Massachusetts. And he wrote all these letters to his wife during the war, and during the Overland campaign, whether at the Wilderness or Spotsylvania, the sergeant was wounded in the tip of his finger. Minor wound, flesh wound. I don't think it took any of the bone. He was dead in 6 weeks. Infection. His wife didn't understand why he fought, didn't understand why he stayed in the Army, didn't understand what it was all about, but she saved the letters. So now there's another account of the war that transformed our country. Shelby Foote famously called it the crossroads of our being. It changed everything, for better or worse. You know, we are not what we would have been without that war. I don't know how it would have turned out without the war. Counterfactual scenarios. The best historian in the world couldn't prove that something would or would not have happened. We just don't know what would have happened. But the war did happen, and we're still studying the consequences and the significance and how it was fought, how it was won, why it was lost. You know, to me, it's a never-ending story. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Copies of the book are up for sale. I can't think of a more appropriate day than Flag Day to talk about Dr. J. Franklin Dyer. The flag and that document that Jonathan was paraphrasing from are what Frank Dyer was fighting for. In New England, history takes you by surprise. And perhaps that's happened to some of you doing a research project, your family genealogy, some local history, what have you. Years ago, a student at UMass Boston, where I taught for 32 years, approached me after class one day and he said, "Would you like to look at some Civil War papers of one of my ancestors?" And I said, of course, little knowing the treasure that was coming, because I assumed that he would bring me a copy of the New York Times from 1861, or perhaps some Confederate currency. Or what I was really hoping to see was his ancestors' compiled service record. And in a few days, the student brought me a thick volume bound in green leather, and it was the surgeon, the surgeon's journal, Dr. J. Franklin Dyer of the 19th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, written entirely in ink, in his own hand, beautiful script, and it contained the excerpts from wartime letters that he had written to his wife in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I was impressed by the
Please welcome Professor Michael Chesson to tell the experiences of Dr. Franklin Dyer, a Civil War surgeon. Mr. Chesson is a founding professor and dean of the newly established American College of History and Legal Studies, located here in Salem. Dr. Chesson has a degree in history from the William and Mary College and a PhD in American history from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Chesson has received many honors and has a long academic career. Besides writing books and memberships in 15 historical societies, I don't know how he does it all. Please welcome Dr. Chesson, and remember after the meeting to sign up for the tour next month. We already plugged that, so we don't have to do it again. So with that, I give you our speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. And actually, my doctorate is from that little school in Cambridge. I did a year at Johns Hopkins, but I had to leave. And I appreciate Jonathan Worth inviting me, and regardless of the uniform. And we reached an agreement and she loaned me several scrapbooks filled with family letters, and I started the editorial process. The letters that she loaned me were those that Frank Dyer wrote from just before Gettysburg, starting in June of 1863 through August of 1864, and his discharge from the Army. Jonah Franklin Dyer was born April 15, 1826, in Eastport, Maine. He was the fourth of 7 children of Charles Dyer, who was a Maine native, and Hannah Snow of Nova Scotia. His roots go back to the founding of New England. He had military ancestors on both sides of his family. Captain Jonah Dyer, his grandfather, fought in the Revolution, was captured by the British, and after his release, settled in Maine. A more distant ancestor, the Quaker Mary Dyer, was hanged, as you know, in Boston Common in 1660. His maternal line descended from Nicholas Snow, a passenger on the Mayflower to Plymouth Plantation in 1623. He married Constance Hopkins, the daughter of Stephen Hopkins. He served under Captain Miles Standish. Nicholas and Constance had 12 children. Their descendants served in various wars against the Indians and also the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War. Jonah's father, Charles Dyer, died in 1844, and Jonah was still 14. Charles Henry Dyer, his oldest brother, was starting the career that would eventually make him a prosperous merchant in Eastport. But at the time of their father's death, he was still an apprentice. He assumed the paternal role as the oldest son. He advised Frank, who by 1846 preferred his middle name to Jonah, and he cared for their mother and their youngest siblings, George and Adelaide. William Snow Dyer had moved a few miles away to run a general store. And in one of the surviving letters, he worried that Charles appears to have the charge of all the family, and it is a heavy burden. He also joshed his younger brother Frank about being a pharmacist. He'd recently apprenticed himself to a druggist, and he said, "Rolling out pills, I think you would look queer." Dr. Franklin Dyer, you know, who would believe it? In a letter written before the Battle of the Wilderness, Dr. Dyer regretted that he had not yet been able to buy a pony for their son Frankie. He said, "I mean that he shall have one sometime, for I know how I wanted such things and couldn't have them. And for that reason I want him to." Entries, knowing a little bit about the Civil War in the East and the Army of the Potomac, and his service in the Army from July of 1861 until August of 1864, when he was mustered out during the siege of Petersburg and returned home. My student said that his aunt had copies of family letters in scrapbooks, along with a variety of items relating to Dr. Dyer, including his surgeon's sword, his green sash, 2 medical kits that he carried on the field of battle, uniform buttons, and some other items. And she controlled the manuscript and would decide who should edit it. Well, some say this conflict is the war that never ended. But I found out very quickly why I did not go into sales. Because when I made a cold call to Mrs. Whitmer, I found her to be a proper New England lady, but just a little bit on the frosty side. She found my academic credentials acceptable. The Harvard degree helped, but she had one big reservation. I'm a white Virginian, a native Southerner. She did not believe that I could edit her ancestors' journal fairly and objectively. And I assured her that I respect physical courage and integrity